Good evening. Welcome to Office Hours. I am the Professor. And last class we talked a little bit about what are called the Proto-Indo-European people. And we also talked about the Indo-European languages. Now, just to remind you, English is an Indo-European language, as are most of the languages of Europe, Iran, and parts of India. There are exceptions, for example, Finnish. But most of the languages in this part of the world fall into that category. Now we're going to move on a little bit today and talk about some of the first Indo-European people and the world in which they lived, and we're going to try to find out a little bit about their language. So to begin, I'd like to talk about one of my comments from last class, and it was actually from a classmate of mine at my university, and he mentioned to me that perhaps it would have been more correct for me to say that the Romanian word for yes came not necessarily from Russian proper, but from the ancient Slavic language from which Russian has emerged, or descended rather. And this is correct, and that's an excellent point. So kudos to my classmate for bringing that up. Moving on, I'd like to talk a little bit about what are called cognates. Now, I don't have enough room on my board to write that down, but I'd like you to remember it. The word spelled C-O-G-N-A-T-E-S. These are cognates. And cognates are words that are shared by languages in the same family that must have come from an ancient word that sounded something like it. And if we track cognates back into the mists of time, then we can find out what some of the proto-ancient Indo-European words must have sounded like. So, let's look at some of these words and try to find out the ancient roots and maybe find out a little bit about the way the Proto-Indo-Europeans talked. Remember, this is a very ancient language, so we're going to resurrect words that are 5,000 years old, maybe even older. So the first word I'd like to talk about, and we can look at words in specific categories. For example, family terms and personal pronouns, and I think I've also got numerals and general cultural words. So the first word I'd like to talk about is the word brother, and this is a family word. There are a lot of family words that come from the same source in Indo-European languages, and in fact I could have a lot more categories on here, but I have a rather small board, so please bear with me. Let's take a look at the English word brother. Now, the Latin word for brother is frater. Doesn't that sound kind of similar? Frater. Frater, yeah. The Russian word is brat. Don't all these words sound more or less the same? So what does that tell us? That tells us that the Proto-Indo-European word for brother must have sounded something like bröter, or something along those lines. Something like bröter, or plöter, something like this. This is a cognate. Moving on, let's take another look at let's take a look at personal pronouns. Now, in English, we don't really use this word anymore, except when we're trying to sound very antique and very ancient, but we still recognize the word thou, right? We still recognize the word thou. And in Latin, they have the word tu. Don't you think that sounds similar? Which is the same word as the Russian ty. Ty means you in Russian. So what do you think the Proto-Indo-European word must have been? Probably something like tu. Let's look at a number word. And numbers are very useful in determining cognates across languages because they tend to change pretty slowly. Let's look at the number 2. What's the Latin word? Duo. What's the Russian word? Dva. So, Proto-Indo-European must have sounded something like dwo, or dvo, or two, something like that. Now, this last category that I have on the board is very interesting because it tells us a lot about Proto-Indo-European culture. It tells us that the ancient Proto-Indo-Europeans must have had some sort of connection between religion and the day, the daytime. So they must have worshipped the sky or some sort of sun god or something like that, because they associated the daytime with divinity. How do we know this? Because words across Indo-European languages associating themselves with daytime and with divinity and with godhood generally sound kind of the same. Let's take a look at the English word day, okay? And then let's take a look at the Latin word deus. What does deus mean? It means God. Sounds kind of like day though, doesn't it? Now the Russian word is den, which means day. Okay, now in Russian and English, the connection between day and God has kind of fallen out, which suggests that the mythology might have changed a little bit as these peoples migrated. But, and of course for the word God we have in English, in Russian they say Bog, which isn't really the same thing. So we have to look at these words to establish this very ancient connection. The Proto-Indo-European word I have written here pi, because that's a term that archaeologists and linguists use very often. But the original word 5,000 years ago for the daytime or the sky or maybe even for God must have sounded something like Dios or Deus, something along those lines. So, moving on, let's move away from cognates right now, and hopefully by now you're able to know a few words in Proto-Indo-European, and maybe if you'd like, there are word lists on the internet that you can look up, and you can find out other words that existed in this ancient language, or that we think might have existed in this ancient language. We can't really know for sure. Now, let's move away from cognates and talk a little bit about the Proto-Indo-Europeans and their world. So, as I said before, the Proto-Indo-Europeans probably lived around 5,000 years ago. Excuse me, I dropped my eraser. Around 5,000 years ago. So, let's write 3,000 BCE. And now let's draw a map of Europe. So here's Scandinavia, France, Spain, Italy, Greece, Turkey, and down here's Africa. Good. And the Caspian. Good. British Isles, maybe. Excellent. So we think, and we talked about this in our last video, that the Proto-Indo-Europeans probably lived somewhere in this region, somewhere in the Ukrainian Pontic steppe sort of area. And how do we know that? From looking at archaeological remnants and tracing the ancient migrations of peoples. But we don't know it for sure. It's just the hypothesis that most linguists and most archaeologists have. Okay, so who were some of the other peoples living in Europe at this time? Remember, this is before anyone had migrated out of this area. This is before any descendants of the Germanic peoples had migrated, or the Slavic peoples, or the Romance, or we might say Italic peoples have migrated out of this region. So who else was there? Was Europe an empty continent full of uncharted wilderness? No, of course not. People had been there for a long time. People had been there for a long time. And, in fact, we know from, for example, place names and from ancient chronicles of the early Slavic peoples that living in this general area were the ancestors of the Finns. The Finns and the Hungarians, and we call these Uralic peoples because they originally lived somewhere around the Ural Mountains. Let's draw that right here. There we go. So, this is one group of people that predates the Indo-Europeans, and they must have maybe come into contact with them, but gradually, as the Slavic peoples branched out, they started to encroach upon the lands of the Finnic, or you might say Uralic peoples. Down here in Spain, before the Indo-Europeans ever moved, were the ancestors of today's Basques, and maybe you know a little bit about Basque. It's a really weird language. It's spoken in Spain, even to